Okay, my talk's entitled Parishes, Pandemics and Paths to Take Post-COVID Historical Options. And it's obviously coming out of reflections really over the last year and a quarter that, excuse me, we've all experienced. Historians are the guardians and producers of precedent. They contextualize current issues and provide a sense of lineage and perspective. They analyze scenarios and compare options from the past. What should now preoccupy those of us concerned with local and parish history as cultural, administrative and political historians in relation to the events of 2020-21? I shall suggest that parish-focused research sheds light on many of our current predicaments, and also that the experience of COVID and its lockdowns may open our eyes to new aspects of the past. Clearly, COVID-19 has raised a host of general historical, medical and economic issues, and many international ones, the scale of which exceeds parochial or local historical questions. One thinks of rights of voluntary association, human movement, civil liberties, the situation of the low paid, racial and class questions of vulnerability, and questions about priorities in medical treatment. Then again, the scale of government intervention, government debt, the furlough scheme, aid to businesses or universal credit raise enormous questions about the role of the state and historical precedent. These take us back to wartime measures and slump and economic recovery in the past. Such issues necessitate analysis beyond the scale of parish and locality. Yet many COVID-related questions are local, parochial in the frameworks of the past or today. Or what was local and parochial has become national or global now. The issues of past pandemics, such as plague, cholera, smallpox, or the influenza of 1918 to 19, still involve local comparisons, for these were usually handled at that level. So do animal diseases, rinderpest, TB, rabies, foot and mouth, or BSE. Implementation of policies remains local. And one thinks of medical care, school attendance, home care or care homes, the history of retail and hospitality, constraints upon movement, rural-urban disamenities, questions of community, the meaning of neighborliness, cross-household contacts, of privacy, solitude, and loneliness. Or there are the functions of kinship and of gossip. There were also the earlier anti-vaccination movements, issues of evacuation and education, let alone of local xenophobia, the place of religion, and many further questions. These all trigger parish-based historical questions, analogies, and issues of precedent. We need to set historical priorities, sometimes in new ways. This talk is a personal look. And to start, a word about terminology. I normally use the word parish precisely and administratively, but here I will often use it interchangeably with locality, except where I obviously refer to its historical religious boundaries and administrative meanings. The current pandemic raises questions about medical history. The slogan, "Protect the NHS," has not inspired confidence in the health service, nor in the politicians whose job that should be. What can we learn from the past about dealing with vulnerable people? How should the state protect its citizens' health? The struggles of the NHS, the bypassing of other medical needs and emergencies, the grotesque waiting times, all point to problems with British healthcare. The UK health record during COVID is among the worst in Europe. I have friends with cancer who waited throughout 2020 to be treated. Dental and ophthalmic care ceased for many in 2020. The mental health system is highly problematical. 1 in 6 children in the Bradford survey of 14,000 children now have mental health problems, a large COVID period increase. A fresh historical look at medical services is needed, despite the commitment of hospital staff. The British two-tier public and private health system speaks for itself. The past was often no better, but we need comparisons. In relation to what historical societies could afford and their respective levels of medical knowledge, how does the local past compare with today? The current situation should prompt new medical history, and beyond a few generations, that usually involves parish history. How did parishes deal with surgeons, nurses, and midwives? Within what administrative frames were they operating? And by what criteria of equity or cost? What access did parishes have to hospitals, and how were those run? Home remedies, medical surrogates, and folk healers were widely used with unclear results. There have been local studies of medical provision, as by Steve King on the Fylde, or recourse to folk healers, as by Owen Davis, or accounts of local doctors in a later era. The history of medicine is a well-funded field, yet research is less focused upon parish medicine. Studies of medical care under the new Poor Law are also scanty, usually comprising particular unions or more generalized history. How were cholera, plague, smallpox, 1918 to 19 flu and the like handled? Samantha Williams, I see, will broach an aspect of this shortly. Parish burial registers point to many such episodes about which we are ignorant. Entries of, I quote, malignant fever, contagious fever, black fever, and so on are unclear. Mortality peaks prompt explanations such as, I quote, probably influenza. At parish level, how were diseases guarded against or transmitted? What quarantines applied, as at Eyam in Derbyshire against plague in 1665-6? How was disease managed under the settlement and master and servant laws? We know more about the transmission of Luddism or Captain Swing than we do about the spread of many illnesses historically. What were the immediate associations of mortality crises, their effects on social and kin relationships, on endogamy and exogamy, parish surname densities, on illegitimacy, the marriage rate and marital fertility? How did such mortality affect apprenticeships, tenancies, recorded business fluctuations, crime, clerical turnover, or escape from towns? What influence did high mortality have on travel restrictions, settlement policies, and the closed or open nature of communities, on poor law policy, the cross-parish movement of corpses, and on memorialisation? How was such mortality reflected in farm and estate accounts, in vestry and guardians' minutes, or in newspapers? What rural and other comparisons emerge? For COVID-19 has highlighted urban disamenities. The three vital event historic interactions are well known from Collyton onwards. The plunge of marriages and baptisms during high burials and their subsequent surge. But we need a broader agenda beyond the pioneering Wrigley and Schofield historical demography, a mortality microhistory that is wide incorporation of sources and effects. COVID-19 has raised questions about the adequacy of care homes and home care. In some counties like Cornwall, the companies and local authorities handling home care were overwhelmed. This was true in many rural areas. The tendency for lone living and widowhood to be concentrated in the west and north of Britain, away from the expanding commuter arcs of London, viz. HS2, has aggravated the problems. And universal credit is widely criticised, let alone the pension systems. The units of welfare administration have markedly extended over past centuries, from the Elizabethan parish to the Poor Law Union in 1834 to the County Council from 1888, and by 1945-8 in many regards to the welfare state. There are technical, administrative, ideological, and other reasons for this. Yet any historian of the Welsh and English Old Poor Law seeing the personal detail in overseers' books, aware of the cultures of parish belonging, noticing the extraordinary accounts and paintings of the local poor in David Diamond's book, Parish and People in a Suffolk Village, allowing for the limitations of knowledge and resources of the earlier periods, must surely ask how this parochial system compared with what we now experience. If we are heading towards constrained globalization, intensified local belonging managed in a precautionary way by the state, local environmentalism, a long-term struggle with mutating viruses spread rapidly by large-scale movement, then should we be looking for some reformation of localized welfare, belonging, and community? COVID has left us in a difficult Janus-faced flux between extreme, even housebound localism and globalization. The judgments and options are further complicated by Brexit in the UK, by environmentalism and international politics. What is or should be normal? What structures of belonging and administration are preferable? Resulting in decisions are now palpable, whether personal, subjective, or commercial. These are huge uncertainties of historical import and direction, and the issues and lessons of scale in particular need to be discussed as priorities by historians. If we turn to the politics of parish religion, for many Christians and people of other faiths, the closure of churches and changes in forms of worship have been received adversely. The Anglican Church and nonconformist denominations will take the opportunity post-COVID to close and sell off many buildings. Further, many elderly people have died. The Church of England has reorganized so many times into ministry areas, combined benefices, or group teams that there is no longer much connection to a historic or ancient parish. How did the parish church link to the community? This is a question of growing historical importance. Historical commentary is already occurring on when in the past such COVID constraints upon religion occurred. In Poland, for example, comparisons are being made with the Nazi period. A Polish academic wrote to me, and I quote, "Never in the history of Poland have churches been closed or access to them been so restrictively limited. Even during the war, the Nazis, or during communism, the communists, more or less, respected the religious life of the conquered population. The Germans had more respect. They considered it a kind of holiness that should be respected. But with COVID in Poland, the churches were closed completely during Easter. The state authorities ordered that each church can be attended by only 5 people, regardless of the size of the church," end of quote. This is accentuating declines in church attendance. Sacraments are suspended to the sick and dying. Parish groups were not allowed to meet, and parish life has changed. This Polish academic continues, I quote, "There was also no traditional annual Christmas gathering. Loneliness swept the world. For many people, especially older people, the church and church-related meetings were the only places where you could feel in community, feel needed, have the motivation to leave the house," end of quote. She mentions much increased sale of antidepressants. She continues, I quote, "What the Germans and the communists did not do, COVID, or rather the reaction to it, did. And I do not use these ubiquitous disinfectants, even horror of horror, placed in churches in stoups instead of holy water," end of quote. Now, such issues are raised in every country and across religions. In largely Christian societies, the religious role of the parish was so fundamental in political and cultural life that this prompts comparisons to periods of church and religious prohibition and persecution, clerical evictions, policy during pandemics and plagues, and the role of the state in religious denial or enforced change. Parish life and politics is losing or has lost this church centrality, or the parochial placement within nonconformist organisations. Where loss occurs, and on this scale, historians should step in. And incidentally, they must also preserve many church records, which otherwise may go the way of the church. Even now, many redundant churches are also redundant in record survival. Loneliness and its history and closely related subjects were attracting attention from many disciplines prior to COVID. Projects were underway on solitude and privacy, notably by Barbara Taylor. And indeed, David Vincent had already published his book on privacy, and his book on solitude was about to appear. Above all British historians, David Vincent seems to me to have had his finger on the pulses of our time. Few historians have been as adept, sensitive, and relevant in their responses to these current topics of great importance. Loneliness, I would define as suffering self-recognition of separateness. It was already diagnosed as an epidemic, as a time bomb, as a major modern problem across all age groups. The campaign to end loneliness was well up and running. Doctor, can you give me a cure for loneliness? The Lancet was reporting and admitting its failure to reply. Those of us who have worked for the Samaritans were wondering if we could face returning to it. Those of us who have recorded history among the elderly were used to the breaking into tears, the hardened statements of regret. I turned to the history of loneliness some years ago after a chance riverside conversation for an hour with an unknown man in Bourton-on-the-Water in the Cotswolds. When it was over, he said, I quote, "Thank you for talking to me. That's the first conversation I've had with anyone for over a month." Then came the enforced lockdowns of COVID, the isolation of families and neighbours, the publicity given to breakers of unclear lockdown rules, the constraints of shielding, the nasty dialectic between fear of loneliness and fear of coronavirus, deteriorations in mental health, increasing use of antidepressants, rising self-harm, growing domestic abuse have all been reported during 2020 to 21. It is not yet clear what the effects on suicide have been, though I'm slightly reassured that early British reports suggest no appreciable rise. International trends are not yet discernible. If loneliness was an urgent matter for historians pre-COVID, it is all the more so now. My own attempts back in 2013 to 15 to launch, research and write a history of loneliness floundered on the disinterest of the ESRC and the Wellcome Trust. Oh my God, what an awful topic, a famous FBA historian and literary critic claimed at me, almost derisively, though I suspect it came close to his bone. Soon after, in despair at British funding organisations, I took early retirement to concentrate on other creative things. COVID shows that, as historians, we must research the issues relevant to community and loneliness, to the predicament of the isolated individual, to the politics of loneliness, to the structures of support that are in place, or often not in place, to deal with chronic isolation. By the politics of loneliness, I mean how people are removed from the presence of others. These problems are widely international, yet they are local as well. Historically and in Britain, they involve the parish. Loneliness has manifest political dimensions. Structures are put in place politically or not put in place. Personal frameworks are local administrative realities. Loneliness relates intensely to areas or cultural zones of subjective belonging. We operate an ideology of self-reliance and individualism, as in ideas of selfhood, and of community substitution for commodity substitution for human relations. Capitalism preys upon isolation. Increasingly permeable permeable divisions have been formed between the public and the private. Loneliness and its allied concepts, alienation, anomie, solitude, in turn have huge effects for the state and its sub-entities, as so many political and philosophical thinkers indicate. Such matters are political, linked to the exercise of power, sustained as such, ancillary upon cultural and administrative expectations. The social science associations of loneliness, that is living alone, bereavement, widowhood, ill health, low income, cultural marginalization, probably in that order many analysts suggest, are factors that are handled politically. They relate to housing, the legal system, health services, the labor market, racial and sexual discrimination. Earlier historians, Toulmin, Smith, Steer, Main, Seabohm, the Webbs, Gom, Homans, Gonner, Tate, and so on, presented the parish as an evolved administrative, legal, and usually agricultural entity. We have in recent decades also seen it in its subjective guises as pertaining to selfhood, as a personal legal identity under settlement law, as an emotional unit of belonging, as Steve King will be discussing shortly, as having distinctive seasonal and folkloric ritual years, as prone to defensive xenophobia. It was an area to which people felt intense personal affiliation. It has also generated an extraordinarily rich outflow of reminiscence, literature and art. Herbert, Clare, Crabbe, John Galt, Constable, Palmer, George Eliot, Hardy, Sturt, T.S. Eliot, Adrian Bell, R.S. Thomas, George Mackay Brown, Ronald Blythe. Such a list would be enormous. Our county record offices rightly use the parish as their ordering principle. The parish is central to any historical conceptualization of community. As such, it is also historically intrinsic to assessing loneliness and personal isolation over time. Its importance in the historical placement of COVID is axiomatic. The loneliness, fear, and even bewilderment that the recent pandemic has produced necessitate research into the parish, to put the present or recent past into perspective, to suggest comparisons, remedies, and precedents. That research needs to consider, inter alia, the following. How have people been absorbed in local communities in the past? How important has family and kinship been within local or further flung areas? What have been the roles of associations linked to the parish? The women's institutes, the religious bodies, the friendly societies, the village schools, the trade union branches, the shared organisation of local work, and so on. How far has loneliness affected earlier parish-based lives? For there is every reason to suspect that loneliness is a long-term and international human condition, as some philosophers such as Ben Mijuskovich have argued. Thomas de Quincey, Rousseau, Dostoevsky, Edvard Munch, Carson McCullers, Jean Wyss, Edward Hopper, Sam Selvin, and others like them had many precursors. In the so-called return to the local that has supposedly occurred during COVID, and with doubts about globalization, what are the centuries-long lessons of parish history as community history? How does one define and qualify any such return to the local? Have we really seen a reinvigoration of the local, the parochial, in something like its earlier guises? Or, for countless people, have we witnessed a distressing abjuration of face-to-face social contacts, a fear and avoidance of others, a reluctance to talk, the pavement sidestepping, the face mask hidden mouth, the angry glare in the supposedly socially distanced cues, a change towards personality introspection? In fact, COVID, to my knowledge, has broken many relationships. This surely is the ultimate in not fitting in, not being part of community. And for medical reasons, it has been politically and socially engineered. Well into the first UK lockdown, an autistic student enthusiastically said to me, I quote, "It's really great. At last, everyone is behaving just like me." End of quote. That's my quotation for 2020. This is tantamount in many cases to a societal failure of personality that much social media has done little to prevent, and which many critics believe has aggravated. To my mind, this is not a return to the personality and face-to-face address of parish society, as we read it in many 19th century and 18th century sources and novels. This realization of the individual thrown entirely onto her or his own resources, in one song, taking a lead role in a cage, unable to tell a smile from a veil, treating a laptop or smartphone as a person surrogate, zooming off to some distant friend, parent, or child once a week, is remote from the kinds of parochial community and sociability found in earlier historical and literary sources. There is little here that approximates to Under the Greenwood Tree, or even to the angry but still sociable tone of the Parish as satire, if I refer to Hardy and Clare, let alone the wider genre of Austen's, Dickens, Mrs. Gaskell, George Eliot, Thackeray, Surtees, and other such writers, or their picaresque predecessors. In fact, what we have seen in 2020 is terribly impoverished socially by comparison. It is more akin to the eventual isolation of Jude the Obscure or Michael Henchard in The Mayor of Casterbridge. The historical agenda here is obvious. How does one assess the sociability, interactions, terms of discourse, personality of our texts, and historical evidence? How does the individual emerge from them? As socially embedded and enhanced in social contacts, or as distanced, lonely, and remote? We can all think of parochial evidence ripe for the asking of these questions, whether we are looking at correspondence, minute books, autobiographies, diaries, novels, or poetry, whether it be Parson Woodford or Anne Lister. Historians of the emotions, considering local history, will find much in recent events to stimulate research. There is the issue of fear, for example, of how it developed in the past, its religious, medical, xenophobic, war-related, racial or superstitious aspects. My father, born in 1918, growing up with the imminence of another world war, once complained to me, I quote, "The trouble with your generation is that you don't know what fear is," end of quote. Then there are the issues of how fear is managed, how it affects or augments state policy, its effects on personal or family interrelations, its results on psychological well-being. We have widely seen grandparents in 2020 adjusting their fear of dying to their wish to see grandchildren. There is no doubt that many issues in the local past have been affected by fear. Fear of famine fever, inducing anti-Irish sentiments in the 1840s. Fear of cholera affecting local antagonisms. Fear of traversing parish boundaries. Consider some of the fearful parish writing of John Clare. Anti-Protestant or anti-Catholic fears. And many of these fears were parish-based, locally defensive in nature. Fear can make people cruel. What I have called the local culture of xenophobia has been alive and kicking. Some Rutland villagers, for example, have been snooping on each other in parishes like Liddington and calling the police if they notice strange cars. The police cooperate with £250 fines. Scratch car retaliation follows. There has been evading of people from certain inner city areas. Selective vaccination avoidance aggravates these problems conducing to inner city no-go areas that take one back historically. Indeed, the whole nature and geography of local capitalism and retail has been radically transformed by COVID fear. Further afield, in Japan, where car number plates indicate their origin, cars from Tokyo have been smashed in northern villages. Gaijin des, that's a foreigner, has come to have superadded fearful association. A bank in Nagano had its windows stoned because one of its staff from outside the area developed COVID. Japanese friends tell me of isolation, lack of neighborly contact, prevailing secrecy about health for fear of recrimination, resistance to COVID testing, bullying of medical staff and their children, refusal of children to return home during the August Obon and New Year seasons, the elevation of privacy protection, as well as xenophobia. Some of this certainly has echoes in the UK. One could escalate examples. These all illuminate aspects of our past too, revealing emotions and motives which affected people deeply. One can go beyond fear to other relevant emotions, boredom, for example, or envy and anger. Those three emotions all have written histories or anthropologies to be developed further. Parish history and the history of emotions were always intertwined, and they seem to me all the more kindred subjects now. David Davis, referring to COVID-related restrictions on movement, commented that, quote, "We have never before had this in British history." My first thought was skeptical. Medieval serfdom, the settlement and vagrancy laws, or the controls upon movement in World War I and II caused by travel permits and food and clothes rationing came to mind. W.H. Davis of Supertramp fame commented on how, I quote, "The rationing of certain commodities made it difficult for us to change our surroundings during the First World War. I was now getting tired of meeting people day after day, but there was no escape. For the Great War had now fastened every individual down to one place, where he was rationed for the necessities of life. Under these conditions, there was nothing to do but to make the best of life in London and wait until the end of the war gave me the freedom to go where I liked," end of quote. Under COVID lockdown, many people would have liked to meet certain others day after day, but spun out their time in loneliness and boredom. In fact, the consensus is that war rationing did not commit people to local fixity, that many people migrated and many evacuated children returned to urban families, and that rationing registration was indeed readily shifted. One could think of other lockdowns, for example, of Hull at Great Yarmouth during 1832 cholera, but these were very localized, not national ones. The earlier English and Welsh settlement laws could block some people's mobility to certain places. For example, if individuals did not provide a settlement certificate, if required. Those in imminent or actual need of poor relief were often removed to parishes of settlement. But demands for certificates were not that common, were parochially distinctive in policy application and slight relative to total mobility. Whether settlement certificates can be seen as precursors of future identity cards or COVID vaccination certificates remains to be judged. Vagrants, as under the 1744 Vagrancy Act, with its wide categories of culprit, or under Elizabethan legislation, found their migration hindered or punished. This was selective and did not hinder other movement. As a statement of quasi-legal intent, describing national regulation, David Davis's statement may be fundamentally correct over recent centuries of British history. That remains for historians to ascertain. It also remains to see how historians will judge vaccine passports, vaccination certificates, and the like in historical perspective. They provoke libertarian discussion. Yet in my African youth, I carried a host of yellow vaccination certificates relating to cholera, smallpox, yellow fever, polio, tetanus, typhoid, paratyphoid A and B vaccine, diphtheria, pertussis, and the like. Whatever the dissension against such certificates or interventions, there is nothing historically new in them or in the way they affect movement. In some African airports of my childhood, failure to comply simply led one to a medical tent nearby. I also found myself quarantined on ships, stranded in places like Mombasa or Beira. Yet, as with the long history of quarantine or of medical isolation, the history of these interventions and barriers remains to be written in a way that places COVID-19 into perspective. Leprosy even came to characterize certain medieval place names, such as Burton Lazars near Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire. Isolation villages was not an alien concept in the past. Think of Eyam in Derbyshire. Consider too any older map of an English county, like Leicestershire. I have one dated 1918. Look at lesser populated areas and notice the isolation hospitals. These sites now resemble abandoned small military depots or aerodromes, with raised earthen platforms where buildings once stood, like deserted medieval villages. One could add many more forms of post-COVID parish history. I was home educated in Africa for many years. The history of parish education does not encompass home education. Perhaps it should now do so. Further, if unemployment continues to rise as a result of COVID, historians should be drawn to that issue. For a historian of my generation, the wheel will then have come full circle. Parochial unemployment was a dominant issue for my book Annals of the Labouring Poor, written during the early Thatcher recessionary years. We have also seen a revival of itinerant retail, familiar to parish historians. Then again, COVID lockdowns have familiarized many people with the natural surroundings of their locality in new ways. I need hardly mention the relevant history of people in the natural world that this involves. Indeed, I did much research during 2020 into symbols of the natural world in burial sites. A melancholy-looking isolated individual with a notebook walking around burial memorials did not attract police attention. And if it had, I had self-justification up my sleeve that would have melted the heart of any Leicestershire police sergeant. Well, historians are resourceful people. Research for our times. Thank you.
Many thanks for a keynote address. I will mute you because I see that we have some issues with an echo. I will unmute you if you need to. Many thanks for that keynote address. I can imagine that there will be a lot of questions or remarks or posts to be made from the audience. So if you want to contribute something, you could raise your hand via the participant screen or post something in the chat, and we'll see what comes up. Thank you very much for that very personal take, in a way, on what we have lived through for the past year, on what we could do as historians with all these new experiences. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, but also a guide on which kind of steps we as historians could take. And also, it reminded me also of with regards to your book on belonging, on, for example, the differences that we see within the parish. So there were these tags and graffitis in Brussels. I'm living in an urban environment, on romanticization of lockdown and the romanticization of staying at home, and how that is a form of class privilege. Or, for example, the issues of undocumented migrants and access to welfare, or the homeless people who were out on the streets and didn't have a place to go, and their civil society had to step in actually to host them and take care of them. So that also reminds me of this notion of local politics of welfare and who actually has access to it and who doesn't. So thank you for agreeing to give the keynote, and thank you for this specific keynote. I see that we're starting to get some questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. One thing that intrigued me immediately was the sort of link between parishes and history of emotions. And I wondered whether you could give a little bit further guidance about where we could start and what, sources we could use and how we would do comparative histories, maybe of the history of emotion. So I was wondering whether there are a few immediate leads that you can think of there.
And as I muted the microphone of Professor Snell, now we will have to unmute it, which is the microphone-shaped icon on the screen. Yes, thank you.
Okay. So many, I was saying, it occurs to me many clerical autobiographies, for example, talk about isolation, talk about loneliness, talk about boredom, talk about being as they see it in geographically less preferential areas, talk about their cultural isolation from their communities. That's a standard. I mean, just look at someone like John Skinner's autobiography. It's quite remarkable the degree of alienation going on there. I think he's based in Somerset in the late 18th century from his parishioners and the alienation and dislike he feels for his parishioners, which is clearly a mutually felt sentiment. I think you can address this in so many historical sources that do relate to the parish. The question is, I think, that one ought to come at those sources with fresh eyes after COVID. One ought to be looking at these issues in the light of what COVID has shown us and the sort of questions that have come to the fore because of COVID. Every generation, every group of historians looks at sources afresh, and so they ought to, and should be asking original questions that are contextual to that historiographical phase. And we are now still in the COVID phase, and it's going to take a long time for this to go away. These are very important questions, and I think they simply necessitate a readdressing of the historical sources. People need to go back to historical sources and say, how did people handle these issues in the past? These issues of boredom, of fear, of loneliness with regard to the emotions, and maybe many other emotions come to mind as well. But much of the history of emotions that I've read is very general, is very non-specific geographically. It's not placed very intimately in relation to community and community history, and to differences of individuals within those communities. So I'm really looking there for historians like the people attending today to go to those sources and to say, well, what, in relation to the parish, in relation to local communities, how do we redefine the history of emotions to deal with some of the issues that have become so salient over the last year and a half?
And do you think that the present day availability, the mass of visual material, the sort of the videos that we now have with this COVID crisis, do you think that that has any mileage in terms of helping us to understand such situations in the past, or is that methodologically entirely uncertain?
Not quite sure which modern visual material you're thinking of, but
I'm just about the present, actually today's sort of parishioners who have all these sort of visual means, YouTube, Instagram, all these kinds of things, to express some of the issues that you're interested in. And obviously we don't have that for most of the periods we are working on ourselves, but is there a methodological way to maybe combine these two, or is that just methodologically unsound?
It's quite a difficult question. Obviously, we're in a totally different technological world compared to the past. are you suggesting there may be visual forms of solace in the past that relate to emotions and that can be used comparatively to address the visual worlds, almost the visual fields of people in the, say, in the 18th century? If that is the case, and if you are suggesting that, then I think that is true. Graveyard memorials, for example, the iconography of graveyard memorials, church paintings, church and chapel visual performances, street theatre, a whole range of things like this come to mind. Chapbook evidence, woodcuts and the like of the pictorial kind that one would find in chapbooks. These forms of visual experience of the past, I think, can be compared to the modern period. I have no particular methodological problem in making the comparisons. Then again, if one addresses more in relation to the history of art, I think, again, looking locally at the history of art, there are a whole range of issues to do with isolation, to do with loneliness. I mean, I've been putting together a whole range of painters who seem to me to address questions of isolation, of loneliness. And often I'm quite surprised at the painters that come to light, because painters like George Morland, for example, for whom loneliness, I think, is a very striking feature of a lot of his paintings. That particular emotion and that way of looking at a painter like George Morland, I don't think it's been addressed by any of the artistic historians like John Barrell and others looking at Morland. But I think COVID does readdress, I think, the way you think about some of these painters. Edvard Munch, for example, most obviously, but Hopper, many others like this. And I think there are, equivalents in the English parochial scene, most notably somebody like Morland. But I think you could extend the same ideas to Constable and quite a few other painters. I think it does open up ways of rethinking, looking at art history in a local context, most certainly.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. We have another question by John Craig, and then afterwards also Hayley Winslade. But John Craig, you are first.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Keith, thank you so much for the paper. I found that enormously rich and an enormous personal pleasure of mine just to hear you, having read your work and enjoyed it and learned so much from it. I was quite struck by the fact that you began. Am I still okay? Everyone seems to have disappeared or something, but I was quite struck by the fact that you began, and I'm enormously persuaded by your more general point of the, in a way, we have to, of course, take stock of our own age in which we live and let that direct our historical questions. What strikes me so particularly is the way in which you began your paper, thinking more broadly about the health service and the role of medical practitioners, as well as many other things. And I was quite struck, living here in North Devon for the time being, away from my Canadian university, kind of stuck because of COVID. Recently there was a story of an intelligent GP dealing with a widower who was deeply lonely and but loved walking, and was able to simply give some very good advice and connect this elderly widower up with a local walking group. I'm not quite sure how this worked in terms of social distancing, but it actually turned out very, very successfully. And that's one story to place alongside, the kind of failure on the part of the established church or maybe nonconformist churches in terms of tackling the challenge of community for people who, for whom the parish church was a very important dimension. And as an early modernist, of course, I've long actually been very critical of many parish clergy, even though there's certain evidence that even a Herbert could actually get alongside his parishioners, but a Richard Greenham in Dry Drayton had enormous difficulties, I would think. But I am struck, alongside my early modern studies, I'll get to the point, alongside my early modern studies, I've actually been quite interested in working with the Mass Observation Archive. and the work of James Hinton in particular, who was at Warwick for many years, and enormously sensitive studies looking at questions of identity through this archive. And two things strike me there. One is the response on the part of hundreds of people who are willing to participate, in some ways as a form of overcoming. I mean, one of the most famous was, of course, Nella Lass up in Barrow-in-Furness, deeply lonely in her marriage, and yet was kind of saved in some way. I don't mean theologically, but through the intervention of, once again, an intelligent medical doctor, you know, encouraging her to actually take certain decisions. But I think that actually just speaking with her helped her make certain decisions out of a deeply unhappy marriage. She left her husband. And I'm struck by, you didn't take us right back to 1208, and I know very little about the interdict and how that was experienced, and maybe we can't say much about that, of 1208 when no one was allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. But there's an interesting question here about maybe the way in which medical practitioners, sensitive, intelligent medical practitioners, have an opportunity now maybe to give help that perhaps they weren't equipped to give 50 years ago or 100 years ago. I mean, I'm generalizing enormously. I'd be just interested in how you might respond to that in terms of a professional group in society, some of whom are stinkers, many of whom are probably trying to do the best, to help more generally folk like us or like other people tackle this question of intense loneliness. Anyway, that's enough from me, and look forward to the rest of the sessions.
That's an interesting question. I mean, my own hunch and my own feeling and my own experience has been recently that the medical profession feel rather beleaguered, that the times they can spend with patients are more and more constrained, that they have to deal with patients wearing face masks, so they can't relate to the whole face of the patient. They can't catch some of the sentiments, some of the impressions they would have been alive to hitherto. They keep more at a distance from the patients within their consulting rooms. They are less inclined to touch patients. They are much more favorably inclined to discuss on the phone rather than see you personally. And when they are actually in discussion with you, they're quite eager to end the discussion and get on to the next person. And that's been my frank experience over the past 2 months. I've actually been rather ill over the past 2 months. And it struck me quite forcibly that this actually is the case in Britain. I'm not blaming medical practitioners, GPs, for this circumstance. I think it's, you know, they're incredibly overworked. They've been forced to go into the vaccination programs. They've had to spend a lot of time involved in mass vaccination programs rather than the kind of work, one-to-one patient, you know, referrals, appointments they're more used to. You know, they've obviously been overworked pretty horrifically in some cases. But if you go back to books like A Fortunate Man by John Berger, looking at that Forest of Dean doctor, and you look at the kind of knowledge that's being displayed there, the time that's being taken, knowledge of patients, the time taken with patients, the multi-varied kinds of engagement with the patients that's being discussed in those earlier texts, like that book. That's a very fine book, I think. But I'm aware of other books dealing with the medical life of GPs in much earlier periods. It seems to me they knew the families better. They spent longer with the patients. They were more helpful in consultation terms, in psychological terms, in emotional support than is the case today. So I'm afraid my answer to your question is largely negative, really, without wishing to be in any way critical of GPs, as I've currently experienced them. I have literally been told to get off the phone on 3 occasions now, with a GP phoning me, talking to me for about 3 minutes, and then she simply has to say, I've got to move on to another patient. I can't answer your question. And you know, I think to myself, well, I'll go on the web and get the answer myself. You know? So that's been my personal experience, without wishing to be too negative about it.
No, thank you for that. And if I just go back to Nella last, that was also her experience. That is what you spoke of earlier. That is that the medical doctor who was able to help her actually spent significant time with her. No, I mean, historically, it seems to me that's you're raising very important evidence that, as you say, in actually a well-funded field, this is something that historians need to be mindful of and pertinent. I know we're not touching so much on the parish dimension there, but no, thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Nice to see you at last.
Thank you both. We have another question, and then there's some discussion going on in the chat, which I will read out as well, so you can answer to them. But first, the next question is by Hayley Winslade, if I have pronounced the name correctly.
Hello, yes, it's Hayley Winslade. I just wanted to make a point. My parish, like many others throughout the country during the pandemic, which is the parish of All Saints Catherington in Hampshire, has been doing an awful lot of worship online. Particularly in the first lockdown, we had a large number of people joining the worship online, which was good. But the problem is, it's the elderly members of the congregation that are very much excluded if they don't have the technical know-how to use a computer, a laptop, or a tablet. And I think parishes are very much going down this avenue now. We're going to see an awful lot more of online activity. And secondly, during Lent, our Lent course was completely online. And we actually had members from other local parishes join. So I think the knock-on effect of moving online for parishes is that we're actually going to see the sort of geographical parish perhaps almost disintegrate, because being online you can join from another parish. And in fact, this Sunday, Rogation Sunday, our vicar, who's just been here a year, he's actually walking the bounds of the parish. He enjoys walking, so it's something he does do. But although he has these very sort of traditional things he does, he's very much a technological motivated person, and a lot of what he's doing is online. And I think it's going to have a big impact long term on the way that parishes are run.
I think that's fascinating in many ways. I mean, there are obviously good or bad things stemming from what you said, depending on how you see it. I mean, my first thought is that you're going to get people attending services to communities they have no real connection with. So the nature of the Anglican community, or the nonconformist community, in inverted commas, that is revealing itself in these kinds of forms of worship, may become more disparate, may become more vague, and may not have much face-to-face meaning beyond any virtual environment. Secondly, the implication could well be, and I suspect this is happening already, and some clergy men and women have told me this, that the readiness of the Church of England to part with its buildings, to sell off its buildings, as with the nonconformist churches, certainly has been aggravated by COVID. And the logic of what you're saying is to make those buildings even more redundant. So if one does push into the kind of direction of virtual worship and virtual meetings of the kind you're mentioning, my first thought really is that surely this is going to be a further bypassing of the physical fabric of the Church of England. And as someone concerned with heritage and social history and the like, I find that a rather disturbing thought, and it certainly is going to accentuate a trend which is very, very much underway already. One could think of other comments to add to what you said, but those are my two main thoughts in relation to what you've said. Thank you.
Thank you both. We have another person who raised their hand, but we also have quite a lengthy discussion in the chat, which is becoming quite interesting. And we will go to the next session in 7 minutes. So I will read out some of the discussion, which I think might be relevant for now, and I'll the floor to the last question, and then we will conclude. So we have several comments, but there's two things which have gotten quite some discussion. One is, I wonder, by Brody Waddell, who asks, I wonder how we get at the history of emotions in parish administration before the video evidence of the Handforth Council Zoom. Official records such as vestry minutes intentionally lied these emotional elements. Stephen King replied, perhaps not later vestry minutes. Putney is striking in these terms, but there are others. And Sylvia Pinches also said about minutes. I've studied the FS Society minutes. Early years reported all the arguments, but then got more respectable and veiled. And we also have a question on from Jeremy Bolton, who says, hi Keith, great keynote. Should historians attempt to count the incidence of loneliness? If so, how? Maybe count the number of anonymous burials. And there's quite a lot, but I won't take the time to read them all out loud. What I'll do instead is I'll give the floor to Sylvia Pinches for the last question, and then I'll pass the word back to you, Keith.
Hi Keith, thanks, that was great. And what I just wanted to say was that whilst obviously the physical interaction of locality, seeing people face to face is vastly important, but there have always been communities of interest that are not immediately face to face, rarefied and small, but I'm thinking of communities of scholars, networks of correspondence, thinking about William Dugdale and some of the 17th century local historians writing to other people, Linnaeus in the 18th century corresponding with people all over the world about botany. So they had connections. They would have loved the internet, but it was all done by correspondence. More of a comment really about that than a question directly, but that there are, I feel there always have been other ways possibly of having more distant community and connection than just the immediate face-to-face.
Yes, and obviously that continues and is enhanced in very many ways by the digital revolution. I think you would agree that over the last year and a half, forms of communication have shifted fairly heavily towards that kind of digital substitute for face-to-face relations. I was arguing in what I said that the idea of a return to the local and a return to face-to-face communication and conviviality, so-called, during the COVID period, which quite a few commentators seem to think has occurred. I mean, I fail to see it, to be honest, in my locality. In fact, in my locality, I see neighbours falling out with each other and refusing to talk thereafter, because some of them have been such a trial to other people in their immediate vicinity. So I don't really see a return to a face-to-face community of anything I recognise in historical record. If anything, I'm seeing, as I quoted from that autistic student, people becoming more and more distant, even if in close proximity to each other, perhaps especially when in close proximity to each other. So I think people, yes, in the past have corresponded, Gilbert White and all the rest of them come to mind. And that form of correspondence and that form of relatedness continues and has been enhanced by COVID. I mean, I'm surprised really the extent to which I found myself zooming to people, you know, in Canada, in Japan, in Australia, in New Zealand and the like, in a way enhancing friendships which are most distinctively not parochial. But then again, that raises issues about the nature of sociability and neighborliness and friendships in the past by comparison with what we're now experiencing and where we're finding our friends today compared to the past. You know, I'm lucky I still find quite a few friends in what historically I would regard as an immediate neighborhood. Many people, it seems to me, less and less do so. And I don't think COVID has brought them back into a neighborly kind of fraternity, not where I am. the issue of how does one detect or find emotional sources, or sources that bear on the history of emotions in parish records. Obviously, there are kinds of parish records which it's hard to find much emotional connection in a removal order or whatever, let alone a settlement certificate. I think you would agree in diaries, in letters, in texts like Anne Lister's diary, in Parson Woodford, in Skinner, in Holland, these clerical autobiographies. I think in many minutes, if you look at the Leicestershire minutes of the Allied Hosiery workers, if you look in Leicestershire minutes of the Methodist Church, you find quite intense emotions being displayed in minute books. Perhaps I would say even in minute books. I'll always remember one Methodist minute book I was looking at in the Leicestershire Record Office, which week after week after week raged about the playing of a certain violin at the services. There's no question about the emotions that were on show in that minute book. So even in a source like that, I think you can find emotions. If you go to church visitation records, I'm astonished. I mean, you're speaking to me from Anglesey, near Anglesey. Looking at some of the Welsh visitation returns, the agitated and highly emotional nature of some of the Anglican or Church in Wales visitation returns against the nonconformists are quite extraordinary. They're certainly replete with emotion. And highly emotional and slanderous language. Again, I don't myself find too much difficulty in finding emotional sources in parish records. I could go on with many other examples, but I think the emotions are certainly there and very much on display in a lot of the records, even if they're not perhaps in the census or some of the more bureaucratic or most bureaucratic kinds of records. I think I've answered some of all those questions. I'm afraid I can't keep up with all the chat room commentary, so I'm relying on Mylene to summarize anything that I need to address there.
Many thanks. Indeed, I would invite everyone to continue this discussion in the chat during the next panel, because I think that you have, with this discussion and with this address, set the tone for our symposium in a very interesting and I cannot even find the words because it's also late evening, but in a very interesting way. It is a lot to continue discussing about. So I want to thank you, Professor Snell, for your keynote address. Normally, I would ask everyone to give a big applause. I guess that now we could express emojis and emoticons and other forms of smileys through the chat, which you might be able to see later. We will see. But thank you very much for your fascinating talk and a big applause.